Hi, I'm Don Rich. Welcome to this episode of Rich Insights. Today we're going to talk about quantitative easing and whether it is a weapon of mass destruction. All right. Now this is going to be the first of a three-part series. We're going to start in the U.S. Right? Talk about the U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. Then we're going to move to Europe. There we have the European Central Bank, or the ECB. And then the third part in the series will focus on Japan. Everyone's implementing quantitative easing, but they're doing it in different manners. So we'll tear it apart and talk to you about the differences and whether or not those differences that we see in other countries may come back to the U.S. as well. All right. Now, the real problem with quantitative easing is that we're nationalizing our markets. All right? We're nationalizing our financial markets. And you'll understand that as we go through this. But we're nationalized. The government's taking control of our financial markets. That's going to be the bottom line here. All right, so let's get started here. Lay things out. Now, there's really three effects to quantitative easing. All right, the first effect is going to be just what it is, how it works, and the fact that it lowers these government interest rates, the treasury rates. The second effect then is how those lower government rates affect consumers. And then the third effect is going to be how those lower rates affect investor behavior. Right? Now what we're going to see when we get all done with this is that the difference between the government and the central bank, the differences that have historically existed get very blurred. All right, it's a difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy being government spending programs versus the monetary policy of the central bank. But those roles get very cloudy. So let's jump right into this, and I think it'll become clear. Now in the U.S. we have the central bank, right? And the central bank has dual mandates, two primary purposes: full employment and price stability. Very simple. Keep as many people working as they can and keep inflation under control. Right? But there's an additional function that the Fed is supposed to provide. And in some sense, it's just as important, but it's not considered one of the two primary mandates. But that function is the Fed is supposed to act as a lender of last resort to maintain liquidity in the financial markets. That's really where quantitative easing comes into play. All right. The Fed is providing liquidity like we've never seen before to financial markets. And we want to look at the effects of that tremendous amount of liquidity. Okay, now let's jump right in here. The first order effect is, what is quantitative easing? How does it work? Well, quantitative easing is when our central bank here, our Federal Reserve, buys securities. Right? And I have buys in air quotes, because they don't actually buy the securities. What they do is they issue IOUs. They issue credits. But effectively, we can think about this as our Fed buying some treasuries securities. All right. What does that do? Well, it reduces the supply of treasury securities outstanding in the marketplace. Right? You're just taking one chunk of the market away. All right. Now, what that does then is for the treasury securities that remain, it drives up the price. And when that price goes up, the yield or the interest rates come down. All right, that's why it's such an effective stimulus tool. It is just like moving interest rates. Now, the problem with this is it really acts as a source of free money for the government. All right. And what I mean by that is every time a debt issuance comes due, the government can issue new debt to pay off the old debt. But they're issuing the new debt at lower and lower interest rates. Right? So it's like a money-making machine in that sense. But the problem with that then is that there's really no effective limit on how much money any government can borrow at these low interest rates. And this unlimited debt issuance just is not feasible. All right, we have $22, $23 trillion of total deficit, right? But last year alone, we added $1 trillion to it. And we're scheduled to add another $1 trillion this year. All right. That rate of increase is just not sustainable. So that's the first order effect of quantitative easing. The second order effect, then, how do those lower rates affect consumers? Well, everything in our personal life, our private lives, whether we know it or not, is actually tied to Treasury interest rates. Right? The rate you charge on your mortgage is tied to the Treasury rates. Your auto loan, your credit cards, right? Everything in your personal life is actually tied to a Treasury rate. So as we bring those Treasury rates down, that lowers your borrowing costs, consumers' borrowing costs. It lowers the consumer financing costs. Now that's a good thing, right? That is a good thing. At least initially it's a good thing. But over time, it creates bubbles or inadvertent effects, right? If we can borrow more and more money as individuals at lower and lower interest rates, then we get housing bubbles. We get auto loans and auto leases, 5, 7+ years now. Really unheard of. We get, unlimited supply of credit cards. So I look at it, it's a little bit like medicine. A little bit of medicine is often a great thing. But the belief that more and more medicine makes things better and better often isn't the case, right? That's when you end up in the comatose state. Well, it's the same thing here. We're talking about the initial effect of quantitative easing in terms of lowering consumer financing costs. That's good. But it's the addictive side effects that get you in trouble. Now, the third order effect, then. Let's talk about that for a second. These lower interest rates, how does that affect investor behavior? Well, a big chunk of the investment community has stated return objectives. And if you have a return expectation that's fixed, what do you do in this lower interest rate environment, right? The returns on all securities become lowered. Well, what it forces you to do is move out on the credit spectrum. What the heck does that mean? Well, it means you have to take more and more risk to get the same return. So what previously was an unacceptable risky investment now suddenly becomes acceptable. All right. So we have this insatiable demand for credit, and that has resulted in one thing is corporations are issuing debt like never before. Right? Like never before. So we got the government taking on debt like never before. We got corporations taking on debt like never before. Right? This is not sustainable. Something has to give. And so the second and third order effects. Again, the second order effect was the effect on consumer behavior, and the third order effect was the effect on investor behavior. The second and third order effects really result in quantitative easing acting as a fiscal stimulus plan, right? Acting as a stimulus plan issued by the government. That's why I said at the very beginning, the line between fiscal and monetary, or the line between the government and the central bank, becomes so blurred in this environment of quantitative easing. Eventually, this is going to be a huge problem. Right? We just become more and more addicted to the liquidity associated with quantitative easing, but it cannot last forever. Right? It doesn't appear to be a problem that's going to come to fruition anytime soon, but certainly over the next few years, it's going to come to a head. We're going to have to pay the piper at some point. So that's our message for today. I'm Don Rich. You just experienced a rich insight. I hope you enjoyed it. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about quantitative easing for Europe. So I hope you join us. Thank you for listening.